Welcome to the therapy room. A place where psychology becomes understanding, and understanding becomes healing. I'm a psychologist passionate about helping people better understand themselves, their emotions, their relationships, and the hidden patterns that shape the human mind. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever received a message and immediately assumed something was wrong? Have you ever waited for a phone call and imagined bad news? Have you ever noticed a small symptom in your body and convinced yourself it might be something serious? Have you ever laid awake at night replaying scenarios that hadn't happened and might never happen? If so, you're not alone. Millions of people spend a large part of their lives preparing for disasters that never arrive. Preparing for rejection that never comes. Preparing for failure that never happens. Preparing for futures that exist only in their imagination. And the strange thing is that most of them know they're doing it. They know they're overthinking. They know they're worrying. They know they're imagining worst-case scenarios. Yet they can't seem to stop. Why? Why does the mind do this? Why does it often ignore the most likely outcome and focus on the most frightening one? Why does a single thought sometimes create hours of anxiety? According to Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, the answer is not that you're weak. It's not that you're irrational. And it's certainly not that you're broken. The answer is that your mind has developed patterns. Automatic ways of interpreting reality. Mental shortcuts that operate so quickly we often don't even notice them. And sometimes those patterns convince us that danger is everywhere. That something bad is about to happen. That we should prepare for the worst. Even when there is very little evidence that anything is wrong. Beck spent decades studying anxiety, depression, and the thinking habits that create emotional suffering. What he discovered changed psychology forever. He found that many people are not suffering because of reality itself. They're suffering because of the way their minds interpret reality. In other words, the event is not always the problem. The meaning we give the event often is. Today we're going to explore one of the most common mental traps human beings fall into. The habit of expecting the worst. We'll examine why your brain does it. Why anxiety feeds on it. How it keeps you trapped in worry. And most importantly, how you can begin freeing yourself from it. Before we begin, I'd like to ask for a small favor. If you're interested in psychology, emotional well-being, personal growth, anxiety, self-awareness, and understanding how the mind really works, consider subscribing to the therapy room. Every subscription helps this channel continue creating thoughtful conversations like this and reach people around the world who may need them. You'll also find links in the profile description to books and additional resources for those who want to continue exploring psychology, human behavior, and personal development. And if this video resonates with you, please share it with someone who tends to worry too much. Someone who constantly imagines the worst. Someone who needs this reminder today. Because what you're afraid of may not be reality. It may simply be a thought. Let's begin. Imagine this. Your phone rings unexpectedly. Immediately, a thought appears. Something must be wrong. A friend doesn't reply to your message. They're upset with me. Your boss asks to speak with you tomorrow. I'm probably in trouble. You notice a strange sensation in your body. What if it's something serious? These thoughts appear so quickly that most people don't even notice them. They simply feel the anxiety that follows. And this was one of Beck's most important discoveries. The emotions we experience are often preceded by thoughts. Thoughts that happen automatically. Thoughts that appear without invitation. Thoughts that seem so natural that we mistake them for reality. Beck called them automatic thoughts. And according to him, these thoughts influence how we feel, how we behave, and how we see the world. Think about how quickly this happens. An event occurs. A thought appears. An emotion follows. Yet most people skip the middle step. They notice the event. They notice the anxiety. But they never notice the thought that connected the two. Imagine two people receiving the exact same message from their boss. The message simply says, Can we talk tomorrow? One person thinks. Maybe there's a new opportunity. The other thinks. I must have done something wrong. Same event. Different thought. Different emotional experience. This simple observation transformed psychology. Because it suggested that emotions are not always created directly by circumstances. They are often influenced by the meaning we assign to those circumstances. And that meaning is frequently shaped by automatic thoughts. The challenge is that automatic thoughts often feel true. They arrive with certainty. They don't introduce themselves as possibilities. They present themselves as facts. I'll fail. They don't like me. Something bad is going to happen. I'm not good enough. I can't handle this. Notice something important. None of these statements are proven. They are predictions, interpretations, assumptions. Yet anxiety treats them as reality. And once that happens, the body responds. Your heart rate increases. Your muscles tense. Your breathing changes. Your attention narrows. Suddenly you're reacting not to what is happening, but to what you believe is happening. This is where many people become trapped. Because the more often a thought appears, the more believable it feels. And the more believable it feels, the more power it gains. Over time, these thoughts become habits. Mental shortcuts. Default explanations. The mind begins interpreting events through the same lens again and again. A neutral situation becomes threatening. An uncertainty becomes a disaster. A possibility becomes a certainty. And before long, anxiety begins running in the background of everyday life. The remarkable thing is that most people don't realize this is happening. They assume they are reacting to reality, when in fact they may be reacting to an interpretation of reality. This was the insight that changed Beck's career. He realized that if we learn to identify these automatic thoughts, we begin reclaiming a degree of control over our emotional lives. Not because we stop having thoughts, but because we stop believing every thought automatically. And that raises an important question. If these thoughts are shaping so much of our experience, why does the mind create them in the first place? Why does it seem so determined to focus on danger? Why is it constantly scanning for what could go wrong? According to Beck, the answer has everything to do with protection. Because your brain is not trying to make you happy. It is trying to keep you safe. And in the next part of our journey, we're going to explore why your mind is always looking for danger, even when no danger exists. Have you ever wondered why your mind seems to focus on everything that could go wrong? Why does it notice risks faster than opportunities? Why does it imagine disasters more easily than happy endings? Why does it often feel easier to believe bad news than good news? For many people, this creates frustration. They think, why am I like this? Why can't I just relax? Why does my brain always assume the worst? Beck believed the answer begins with a simple realization. Your mind is not trying to make you miserable. It is trying to protect you. And that changes everything. Because when we understand the purpose behind anxiety, we begin seeing it differently. Imagine our ancestors thousands of years ago. One person hears a sound in the bushes and ignores it. Another assumes it might be a predator. Who is more likely to survive? The cautious one. The one who pays attention to danger. The one who prepares for the worst. For most of human history, expecting danger was useful. It increased survival. It helped people avoid threats. It kept them alive. The human brain evolved to prioritize safety. Not happiness. Not peace. Not confidence. Safety. And because of that, the brain developed something psychologists sometimes call a negativity bias. A tendency to pay more attention to potential threats than potential rewards. Think about how this works in everyday life. You receive 10 compliments. And 1 criticism. Which one stays in your mind? Usually the criticism. You have a week filled with ordinary events. And 1 uncomfortable moment. Which one do you replay at night? Usually the uncomfortable moment. The mind naturally gives more attention to what it perceives as danger. Because from an evolutionary perspective, missing a threat was costly. Missing a compliment wasn't. But here's the problem. The modern world is very different from the world our brains evolved in. Most of the dangers we face today are not physical. They're psychological. Social rejection. Embarrassment. Failure. Uncertainty. Disappointment. The brain often responds to these experiences using the same alarm system that once protected us from predators. As far as your nervous system is concerned, uncertainty can feel like danger. Not knowing what will happen can feel like danger. Waiting for an answer can feel like danger. Being evaluated can feel like danger. And once the brain senses danger, it begins doing what it does best. Searching for problems. Searching for threats. Searching for what could go wrong. At first glance, this sounds helpful. After all, if you can predict problems, maybe you can avoid them. But anxiety takes this protective instinct too far. Instead of preparing for realistic risks, it begins preparing for imagined ones. Instead of asking, what is likely to happen? It asks, what is the worst thing that could happen? And then it treats that possibility as if it were probable. This is where suffering often begins. Because the anxious mind confuses possibility with probability. Anything is possible. But not everything is likely. Yet anxiety rarely cares about likelihood. It focuses on possibility. A plane could crash. Someone could reject you. You could embarrass yourself. Something could go wrong. And because those outcomes are possible, the mind starts treating them as threats. Even when the actual probability is extremely small. This is why worry can feel endless. There's always another possibility. Another risk. Another uncertainty. Another what if. The anxious brain believes that if it keeps thinking long enough, it will eventually find certainty. But certainty never arrives. Because life itself is uncertain. And so the mind continues searching. Continues scanning. Continues preparing. Continues worrying. Not because it is broken. Because it is trying too hard to protect you. Aaron Beck understood something profound. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty. The goal is not to eliminate risk. The goal is not to stop your brain from noticing danger. The goal is to learn the difference between a realistic threat and an imagined catastrophe. And that brings us to one of the most important concepts in all of cognitive therapy. A mental habit so common that millions of people experience it every day without realizing it. A habit Aaron Beck spent years studying. A habit called catastrophizing. And once you understand it, you'll begin seeing it everywhere. In your worries. In your fears. In your assumptions. Perhaps even in your own thoughts. Imagine you're waiting for a text message. Hours pass. No response. At first, the thought is simple. They haven't replied yet. A completely neutral observation. A fact. But then something happens. The mind begins filling in the blanks. Maybe they're upset with me. Maybe I said something wrong. Maybe they don't want to talk to me anymore. Maybe our relationship is changing. Maybe I've ruined everything. Notice how quickly the story escalates. One missing message becomes a crisis. One uncertainty becomes a disaster. One possibility becomes a certainty. This is what Aaron Beck called catastrophizing. One of the most common thinking traps in the human mind. Catastrophizing occurs when we automatically assume the worst possible outcome and treat it as the most likely outcome. Think about how often this happens. A small mistake at work becomes, I'm going to lose my job. A medical symptom becomes, what if it's something serious? A difficult conversation becomes, this relationship is over. A financial challenge becomes, my future is ruined. The mind takes a possibility and transforms it into a catastrophe. And the remarkable thing is that this process often happens in seconds. So quickly that we barely notice it. We don't experience it as imagination. We experience it as reality. This was one of Beck's most important observations. People are often not reacting to events. They are reacting to their predictions about events. And when those predictions are catastrophic, anxiety naturally follows. Imagine watching a movie where every scene automatically ends in disaster. Every uncertainty. Every challenge. Every setback. Every unanswered question. The ending is always terrible. Eventually, you'd become anxious too. Because the future would constantly appear threatening. This is exactly what catastrophizing does. It turns the future into a horror movie written by anxiety. And the strange part is that the anxious mind believes it is being helpful. It thinks, if I prepare for the worst, I'll be safe. If I expect disaster, I won't be surprised. If I think about every possible problem, I'll be ready. But does that actually happen? Think about your own life. How many disasters have you imagined? How many sleepless nights have you spent preparing for outcomes that never arrived? How many conversations did you rehearse? How many failures did you predict? How many catastrophes never happened? For many people, the answer is most of them. Yet the mind rarely learns this lesson. Because anxiety has a short memory. When the catastrophe doesn't happen, the mind doesn't say, I was wrong. Instead, it often says, good thing I worried about it. As if the worrying itself prevented the disaster. This creates a powerful illusion. The illusion that worry is protection. That anxiety is preparation. That imagining disaster keeps us safe. But often the opposite is true. The disaster never arrives. The suffering comes from imagining it. Think about that carefully. The event never happens. Yet the fear is real. The stress is real. The sleepless nights are real. The tension is real. The emotional pain is real. In many cases, the catastrophe exists only in the imagination. But the suffering exists in reality. This is why catastrophizing is so exhausting. It forces people to live through painful experiences twice. Once in their imagination. And once in reality, if the event ever happens at all. Most of the time, it never does. Beck spent years helping people recognize this pattern. Not because he wanted them to think positively. Not because he wanted them to ignore risks. But because he wanted them to think accurately. To see reality more clearly. To recognize when their minds were confusing possibility with probability. Because there is a huge difference between this could happen and this will happen. Anxiety often treats those statements as identical. They are not. And once you begin recognizing that difference, something remarkable happens. You start creating space between yourself and your thoughts. You stop automatically believing every frightening prediction. You begin asking questions. You begin examining the evidence. And for the first time, you may notice something surprising. Just because a thought feels true doesn't mean it is true. And that realization changes everything. Because in the next part of our journey, we're going to explore why certain thoughts become so convincing that they start feeling like facts. And understanding that process may be one of the most important steps toward freedom from anxiety. Imagine you're walking alone at night. You hear footsteps behind you. Immediately, a thought appears. Someone is following me. Your heart starts racing. Your muscles tense. Your breathing changes. Your body prepares for danger. Now imagine turning around and realizing it's simply another person walking home. What happened? The fear was real. But the threat wasn't. This simple example illustrates one of Beck's most important insights. The mind often reacts not to reality itself, but to its interpretation of reality. And when those interpretations become frightening enough, they begin feeling like facts. This is where many people become trapped. Not because they have anxious thoughts. Everyone has anxious thoughts. The problem begins when thoughts stop feeling like possibilities and start feeling like reality. Think about how often this happens. You think, I'm going to fail. And instead of recognizing it as a thought, you experience it as a prediction. A certainty. A fact. You think, they must be upset with me. And suddenly you behave as though you know what another person is thinking. You think, something bad is about to happen. And your body responds as though danger is already present. Notice what has happened. The thought has become reality. At least emotionally. Beck observed this pattern constantly in his patients. Many were not suffering because of what was actually happening. They were suffering because of what they believed was happening. And the distinction matters. Because thoughts are not facts. Thoughts are mental events. Nothing more. Nothing less. Yet the anxious mind often treats every thought as evidence. Every fear as information. Every worry as a warning. Imagine standing beside a river. Leaves float by on the surface of the water. Some are beautiful. Some are ordinary. Some are unpleasant. Would you assume every leaf is important? Would you stop the river to examine each one? Of course not. You would simply watch them pass. Beck believed thoughts work in much the same way. Thousands of thoughts move through the mind every day. Some helpful. Some unhelpful. Some accurate. Some inaccurate. The problem is that anxious individuals often grab onto the frightening ones. They stop the river. They hold on to the thought. They examine it. Analyze it. Replay it. Argue with it. Fear it. Until eventually it feels more convincing than reality itself. Think about a common example. A person notices a headache. The thought appears. What if it's something serious? The thought creates anxiety. The anxiety increases attention. The increased attention makes the symptom feel more noticeable. The symptom feels stronger. Which creates more fear. Which creates more attention. Which creates more symptoms. Before long, the person feels certain something is wrong. Not because evidence exists. Because the thought has been repeated so many times that it feels true. This is one of anxiety's greatest tricks. Repetition creates familiarity. And familiarity often feels like truth. The more you think something, the more believable it becomes. Even when there is little evidence supporting it. This is why Beck encouraged people to become curious about their thoughts. Not obedient to them. Curious. To ask questions. What evidence supports this thought? What evidence contradicts it? Am I treating a possibility as a certainty? Am I assuming I know the future? Am I assuming I know what other people think? Would I believe this thought so quickly if it belonged to someone else? These questions create something powerful. Distance. And distance changes everything. Because when you create distance from a thought, you stop being controlled by it. You begin observing it instead. And once you begin observing your thoughts, something remarkable happens. You realize that many of them are not predictions. They're stories. Stories your mind tells in an attempt to keep you safe. Stories that often exaggerate danger. Stories that mistake uncertainty for catastrophe. Stories that feel convincing, but are not necessarily true. And this leads us to one of the most important questions in the entire conversation. If anxious thoughts create fear, what happens when fear creates more anxious thoughts? What happens when worry begins feeding itself? What happens when the mind becomes trapped in an endless cycle? Because that cycle has a name. And Beck spent years helping people break free from it. It's called the anxiety loop. And once you see it, you'll start noticing it everywhere. Imagine this. You have an important meeting tomorrow. A presentation. An interview. A difficult conversation. Something important. A thought appears. What if I mess this up? At first, it seems harmless. Just a thought. But then your body responds. Your heart beats a little faster. Your stomach tightens. You feel tension in your chest. Suddenly, another thought appears. Why am I feeling anxious? And then another. This must mean something is wrong. And then another. What if I can't handle tomorrow? Without realizing it, you've entered what Beck called a vicious cycle. The anxiety loop. A self-reinforcing pattern where thoughts create fear. And fear creates more thoughts. Think about how quickly this happens. A frightening thought creates anxiety. The anxiety creates physical sensations. The sensations feel alarming. The mind interprets those sensations as evidence of danger. That interpretation creates more anxiety, which creates more sensations, which creates more fearful thoughts. Round and round it goes, like a wheel that keeps spinning faster. And the longer it spins, the harder it becomes to see where it started. This is one of the reasons anxiety can feel so overwhelming. People often believe they are afraid of an external event. But many times, they are reacting to their own reaction. Think about that. A person worries about an upcoming flight. Their anxiety increases. Their heart starts racing. Then they notice the racing heart. And suddenly they begin worrying about the anxiety itself. Now they're anxious about being anxious. The original fear becomes secondary. The anxiety loop takes over. Beck observed this pattern repeatedly. Not only in anxiety disorders, but in everyday life. Because the loop can attach itself to almost anything. Health, relationships, work, money, the future, even happiness. Some people become so accustomed to worrying that calm begins to feel suspicious. Everything is going well. Life is peaceful. Nothing appears wrong. And then a thought appears. This feels too good. What am I missing? What if something bad is about to happen? The mind starts searching for danger. And eventually, it finds something to worry about. Because anxiety rarely needs evidence. It only needs uncertainty. And uncertainty exists everywhere. This is why reassurance often provides only temporary relief. Imagine someone worried about a medical symptom. They seek reassurance. The doctor says everything is fine. Relief arrives. For a moment. Then another thought appears. What if they missed something? And the cycle begins again. Because the problem was never the symptom. The problem was the loop. And until the loop is interrupted, the mind continues searching for new reasons to worry. Beck understood something important. The goal is not to eliminate every anxious thought. That would be impossible. The goal is to stop feeding the cycle. To recognize the pattern before it takes control. To notice the first thought. To notice the first interpretation. To notice the moment anxiety begins creating stories. Because awareness creates choice. And choice creates freedom. Imagine standing beside a snowball rolling down a hill. At the top, it's small. Easy to stop. Easy to redirect. But the longer it rolls, the larger it becomes. The more difficult it is to control. Anxiety works in much the same way. The earlier you recognize the pattern, the easier it becomes to interrupt. The longer the cycle continues, the more convincing it feels. And here's the remarkable thing. The anxiety loop survives because it constantly convinces you that danger is likely. But is it? Are the terrible outcomes your mind predicts actually as probable as they feel? Or is anxiety distorting your perception? Because in the next part of our journey, we're going to explore one of Beck's most important discoveries. Why bad things often feel far more likely than they really are. An understanding that may completely change the way you relate to your fears. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever been absolutely convinced that something bad was going to happen? Only to discover later that everything was fine? Maybe you were certain someone was angry with you. Certain you had failed. Certain the relationship was ending. Certain the medical test would bring bad news. Certain disaster was around the corner. And yet, none of it happened. If you've experienced this, you're not alone. In fact, Beck observed this pattern so frequently that it became one of the foundations of cognitive therapy. Because anxious people often don't just imagine bad outcomes. They overestimate how likely those outcomes are. And this is where anxiety becomes deceptive. Imagine you're standing in front of two doors. Behind one door is a realistic outcome. Behind the other is a catastrophe. Which door does anxiety point toward? Almost always the catastrophe. Not because it's more likely. Because it's more frightening. And the human mind has a tendency to confuse emotional intensity with probability. Think about that carefully. Just because something feels frightening doesn't mean it's likely. Yet anxiety constantly blurs this distinction. A plane crash is frightening, but statistically rare. A serious illness is frightening, but often far less likely than the mind suggests. Rejection is painful, but rarely as catastrophic as anxiety predicts. The anxious mind focuses on what is possible. Reality focuses on what is probable. And those are not the same thing. Anything is possible, but not everything is likely. This may be one of the most important lessons Beck ever taught. Anxiety asks, what if the worst happens? Reality asks, how likely is that outcome? Notice the difference. One question generates fear. The other generates perspective. And perspective is something anxiety desperately tries to take away. Because once anxiety narrows your attention, it begins filtering information. You start noticing evidence that supports your fears. And overlooking evidence that contradicts them. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as confirmation bias. The tendency to search for information that confirms what we already believe. Imagine you're worried that people don't like you. Suddenly, every delayed text message feels significant. Every awkward conversation feels important. Every neutral expression feels suspicious. The mind begins collecting evidence. Not because the evidence is accurate. Because the mind is looking for it. It's like buying a red car and suddenly seeing red cars everywhere. They were always there. Your attention simply changed. Anxiety works the same way. It trains your attention to look for danger. And once attention is focused on danger, danger begins appearing everywhere. This creates a powerful illusion. The illusion that your fears are being confirmed. When in reality, your attention is being selective. Beck understood something remarkable. People rarely suffer because they lack information. They suffer because they interpret information through distorted lenses. A person waiting for medical results notices every sensation in their body. A person afraid of rejection notices every social imperfection. A person worried about failure notices every mistake. The mind becomes a detective searching for evidence of catastrophe. And when you're searching hard enough, you'll always find something. But finding evidence is not the same as finding truth. This is why anxiety often feels convincing. Not because it is accurate. Because it is selective. It shows you one possibility. Then hides all the others. It shines a spotlight on danger. And leaves everything else in the dark. But reality is larger than the spotlight. Much larger. And this is where Beck encouraged people to ask a powerful question. What is the evidence? Not. What am I afraid of? Not. What if? Not. What could go wrong? Simply. What is the evidence? Because evidence pulls us back toward reality. Evidence interrupts catastrophizing. Evidence challenges assumptions. Evidence creates balance. And once we begin looking at evidence instead of fear, something interesting happens. Many of our predictions start losing their certainty. The catastrophe begins looking less inevitable. The future begins looking less threatening. The mind begins relaxing its grip. And eventually we arrive at a question that changes everything. What if the worst-case scenario your mind keeps rehearsing never happens? What if you've spent years preparing for disasters that only existed in imagination? What if anxiety has been asking the wrong question all along? Because in the next part of our journey, we're going to explore one of the most powerful realizations in Aaron Beck's work. The possibility that the future you're afraid of may never arrive. And that realization has the power to change the way you think forever. Let's imagine something for a moment. Imagine you could go back and visit yourself 5 years ago. Not to change anything. Just to observe. You would see every fear. Every sleepless night. Every worry. Every scenario your mind rehearsed over and over again. You would remember the things you were convinced would happen. The disasters. The failures. The rejections. The catastrophes. And then you would ask a simple question. How many of them actually came true? For many people, the answer is surprisingly small. Sometimes none of them. Yet the suffering was real. The fear was real. The anxiety was real. The lost sleep was real. The emotional exhaustion was real. Think about how extraordinary that is. The event never happened. But the suffering did. Aaron Beck spent years helping people recognize this pattern. Not because he wanted them to ignore risks. But because he wanted them to see how much of their suffering was being created by imagined futures. Imagine carrying a backpack every day. A heavy backpack. Filled with stones. Each stone represents a future disaster you're trying to prepare for. What if I fail? What if I get sick? What if they reject me? What if I lose everything? What if something terrible happens? Now imagine that most of those stones never become real. You've carried the weight. But the disaster never arrived. This is what anxiety often does. It asks us to suffer now for problems that may never exist. And because the future is uncertain, the list never ends. There's always another possibility. Another risk. Another scenario. Another what if. This is why anxiety can become so exhausting. The mind keeps demanding preparation for futures that have not happened. And may never happen. Aaron Beck understood something important. The anxious mind often believes that worrying is responsible. That worrying is preparation. That worrying is protection. But is it? Think about the things you worried about most intensely. Did the worrying prevent them? Did the worrying solve them? Did the worrying control the future? Usually not. Yet the mind keeps returning to the same strategy. As if enough worry will eventually create certainty. But certainty is not available. Not to you. Not to me. Not to anyone. Life has never offered certainty. Only possibility. And perhaps that is one of the hardest truths for anxious people to accept. The future cannot be controlled. It can only be lived. Think about how much life anxiety steals. Not because disasters happen. Because disasters are anticipated. People miss today's peace while trying to protect themselves from tomorrow's uncertainty. They miss today's joy while rehearsing tomorrow's problems. They miss today's opportunities while preparing for tomorrow's dangers. In a strange way, anxiety convinces people to live in a future that does not exist. And in doing so, it pulls them away from the present. The only place life is actually happening. This doesn't mean bad things never occur. Of course they do. Life contains challenges. Loss. Disappointment. Pain. No psychological approach can eliminate uncertainty. Aaron Beck never promised that. What he taught was something far more realistic. Most of the suffering we experience comes not from the event itself, but from the countless times we imagine the event beforehand. And when the event finally arrives, if it arrives at all, we often discover something surprising. We are stronger than we thought. More resilient than we imagined. More capable than anxiety ever allowed us to believe. This is one of anxiety's greatest lies. It tells you that you won't be able to cope, that you won't survive, that you'll fall apart. Yet time and time again, people face challenges and discover strength they never knew they possessed. Not because the challenge disappeared, because they were stronger than the fear predicted. And perhaps that's the question anxiety rarely asks. What if you can handle it? What if you're more resilient than you think? What if the future isn't as dangerous as anxiety insists? What if the worst never happens? And even if something difficult does happen, what if you're capable of facing it? That possibility changes everything. Because suddenly the future becomes less frightening. The grip of worry begins to loosen. And the mind starts realizing that it doesn't need to prepare for every possible disaster. It only needs to meet reality when reality arrives. And that brings us to the final lesson Aaron Beck wanted people to understand. The lesson that sits at the heart of emotional freedom. How to stop living in imagined futures. And start trusting reality again. Let's return to the question that brought us here. Why do you always think the worst will happen? After everything we've explored today, perhaps the answer feels a little clearer. Not because you're weak. Not because you're irrational. Not because something is wrong with you. But because your mind has been trying to protect you. The problem is that protection sometimes becomes overprotection. And overprotection often creates fear where fear isn't needed. Aaron Beck spent much of his life helping people understand a simple but profound truth. Your thoughts matter. But they are not reality. Think about how much suffering comes from forgetting this distinction. A thought appears. A prediction. A possibility. A fear. And before long, it becomes a certainty. A fact. A future that seems inevitable. Yet so often, life tells a different story. The conversation goes better than expected. The test comes back normal. The relationship survives. The mistake gets fixed. The challenge is overcome. The catastrophe never arrives. And suddenly you realize something. You spent days, weeks, months, perhaps years, preparing for a future that never came. How much of your life has anxiety stolen this way? How many peaceful moments were interrupted by imagined disasters? How many opportunities were overshadowed by fear? How many beautiful experiences were missed because your mind was somewhere else? Trying to predict tomorrow? Aaron Beck believed that emotional freedom begins when we learn to question our thoughts rather than automatically obey them. Not because every thought is wrong, but because every thought deserves examination. Especially the frightening ones. Especially the catastrophic ones. Especially the ones that arrive claiming certainty about a future that has not happened. Because the future is not a fact. It is a possibility. And possibilities are not predictions. This is one of the most liberating truths in psychology. You do not need to solve every future problem today. You do not need to rehearse every disaster. You do not need to prepare for every possible outcome. You only need to meet reality when reality arrives. And when it does, you may discover something anxiety never wanted you to know. You are stronger than you think. More resilient than you imagine. More capable than your fears predict. The human mind has an extraordinary ability to adapt. To recover. To heal. To grow. And perhaps the greatest lesson Aaron Beck left us is this. A thought can feel true. Without being true. And once you understand that, anxiety begins losing some of its power. Before we finish, I'd love to hear from you. What is a fear you spent a long time worrying about that never actually happened? Share your experience in the comments below. You may be surprised by how many people recognize themselves in your story. And if this conversation helped you today, please consider subscribing to the Therapy Room. This channel is still growing, and every subscription genuinely helps us continue creating thoughtful content about psychology, emotional healing, anxiety, relationships, personal growth, and understanding the human mind. Your support allows us to keep bringing these conversations to people around the world who may need them. If you'd like to continue your journey beyond these videos, you'll also find links in the channel description to our books and resources on psychology, mindset, emotional well-being, self-awareness, communication, mental resilience, and personal development. Many people have found them to be valuable companions on their path toward understanding themselves and creating a more meaningful life. And if someone came to mind while watching this video, a friend, a family member, a partner, someone who constantly worries, someone who always expects the worst, please share this video with them. These conversations are created with great care, and sometimes a single idea arrives at exactly the right moment. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for your trust. And thank you, Beck, for reminding us that our minds are powerful storytellers. But stories are not facts. Remember, the worst isn't real. It's a prediction. And predictions are not reality. Take care of yourself. And I'll see you in the next conversation.